Statement of Ulbrich von Closen regarding a discovered tomb near his estate in the Black Forest. Original statement given as part of a letter to Jonah Magnus, March 31st, 1816. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. My dearest Jonah, forgive my writing you this letter so soon after the last. You must think me dreadful for not even giving you a chance at a reply, but I recall that during your visit last spring you mentioned your fascination with the macabre and the strange, and pressed upon me as to whether there were any such lore or legends that I myself were familiar with. Wolfgang writes me that you are acquiring quite the collection, and I feel that I now have something that belongs with it, far more than any of the fairy stories or old maids' tales that I told you before. Put quite simply, I have had a most terrifying encounter. 2 encounters, really, I suppose, and I pray to the Lord that I shall have no more, for I honestly believe I should die, from fear if not from violence, were I forced to meet the thing again. I'm sure you must think me the most dreadful bore speaking around the thing so, but I feel that to understand all I must begin my tale some time before the apparition itself appeared, with my travels down to Württemberg. My family has a small estate there, in the heart of the Schwarzwald, what you would call the Black Forest, near a small town by the name of Schramberg. This estate belonged to my brother, Henrik, and when he passed away it descended to my nephew Wilhelm. He was barely in his 14th year when Henrik died, and his mother had passed while birthing him, so myself and Clara have since made every effort to provide him with guidance and such affection as he may have lost. This felt especially keen as we have ourselves been unable to conceive a child, and so we felt it our duty to teach Wilhelm what we would have impressed upon a son of our own. The profligacy of youth is always a danger, and we felt it our duty to help guide him, where we could, along the path of virtue. We needn't have worried ourselves overly. I have never met so sober and prudent a soul as seems to exist within young Wilhelm. Nonetheless, because of this we have remained close with my nephew through the years, despite the distance. When he took ill this last winter, naturally we made arrangements to travel to his home in the Schwarzwald and offer what comfort we could. The journey was difficult, as I suppose is to be expected when traveling in winter, but Wilhelm's condition brooked no delays. At first, the worst we had to contend with, coming from Bavaria, was the lack of provision in the inns where we took lodging, as we were told over and over again how rare guests were this time of year. Still, say what you will about the German Confederation, and I know you certainly have a lot of opinions on that, my friend, but it has made traveling a lot quicker, and I was certainly grateful for that. When we entered Württemberg, however, our way was much harder. The snow fell thicker in the Schwarzwald, compelling us at last to trade the coach for a sleigh. You have never known winter in the Black Forest, have you? I know that you will say you have snows and forests in England, but I have seen what you call forests, and can tell you that there can be no comparison to the Schwarzwald, its trees covered in a dense canopy of untouched snow. There is such a silence there as I have never encountered anywhere else on earth, with every sound seeming to die the moment it touches that soft white blanket of virgin snow. By day it is the most beautiful serenity, this calm stillness. But by night, oh my friend, by night it becomes something altogether else. The quiet of the forest, it becomes like the world is holding its breath, waiting to strike. And in those parts where the canopy clears enough that the moon shines down, it casts everything into the most ghostly shades. I lost count of the number of times I swore I saw figures in the shadows, briefly illuminated by the moonlit glow of that frozen land. At one point I even demanded the sleigh be stopped, so I could make an examination of the area with a brace of pistols. But of course I found nothing. It was in such a state of mind that we arrived at Wilhelm's estate near Schramberg. We were greeted by Wilhelm's servants and told of their master's condition. The doctor had, apparently, braved the roads from Schramberg some few days ago and had given what medicine he could. Since then, the servants told us, he had been steadily improving, but was still very weak. I will confess at this news to feeling slightly unnecessary, but upon entering Wilhelm's chamber, the happiness evident upon his face when he saw Clara and myself put all such thoughts to rest. Wilhelm was in recovery, but I had no intention of travelling back through that silent, icy stillness unless absolutely necessary, and Clara agreed. We made plans to winter there with Wilhelm. There was room enough for us, though our chamber was more modest than what we would have been accustomed to. I will admit that I didn't entirely relish the thought of staying in the Schwarzwald until the spring thaw, but of the courses of action we had at our disposal, it was the one I found to be the most agreeable. And so began what was to be a lengthy sojourn near Schramberg, and truly have I never wished more keenly that I had been able to bring my library with me. I had but a few books with me, and Wilhelm, despite his not inconsiderable intelligence, had even fewer. In the end we played a lot of cribbage and listened to Clara play many a tune on the pianoforte. My wife has never had a singular voice, but her skills upon the keys more than make up for it. I myself would often take long walks through the surrounding woods during the early afternoon, when the cold was tolerable. Sometimes I would make my way the 2 miles to neighboring Schramberg, but more often I would simply choose a direction and stroll into the trees for as long as my fancy held me, and then simply follow my own trail of footprints back to what was, for the moment, my home. It was on one of these walks, some months into our stay, that I came upon that ancient graveyard. It must have been sunken slightly into the ground itself, as all I could see of the grave markers themselves were the merest tip of worn and crumbled granite above the snow. I could not guess at the size of the place, as every few seconds, whichever way I walked, I would spot another small bud of memorial stone blossoming through the frosted earth. I dug some snow from in front of one of the headstones. It had a broken angel atop it, both wings snapped and fallen. But the inscription was far too worn to make out any of the words. I had all but made up my mind to leave, as I knew I had little over an hour before the light began to fail me. As I turned to do so, however, I spied something not far removed among the trees, far larger and more intriguing than the graves I had found thus far. It stood about 5 feet proud above the snow, and the stone was far better quality than what I had seen so far. A small mausoleum. The door, once a sturdy iron grate, had long since rusted off its hinges, leaving only a gaping black aperture that seemed to lead deeper than the dimensions of the mausoleum would allow. Over the top, barely readable, but still most definitely there, was the name Johann von Württemberg. I was fascinated. I knew my local history well enough, and certainly was not aware of any noble of the Württemberg line named Johann. I was sure he had never been a count or a prince. More than that, there had never been, as far as I could recall, any town or settlement near this spot that could have supported a cemetery of such size. So who was Johann von Württemberg? And why had he built a mausoleum here, in the middle of the Schwarzwald, 6 miles or more from Schramberg? I had no time to investigate any further, for I realized that I needed to leave immediately if I was to return to my wife and nephew before sundown. I turned away and followed my path back as quickly as I dared. While I would normally be satisfied forging a new path the next day, something in the thought of that silent tomb drew me back, and I found myself marking trees with my pocket knife to make finding my way back the following day that much easier. I asked Wilhelm that evening over dinner whether he had ever heard of Johann von Württemberg, or was aware of the mausoleum a few miles north from his home. He told me no to both. He rarely spent time in the forest around, save for hunting, and the hunting was usually poor in the north, as the trees were too close together to easily navigate with a horse, and he had never heard of this Johann. I made some inquiries as to where I could look further into the history of the area, but there was no library of a decent size within near distance of Schramberg, and as I mentioned, Wilhelm had little in the way of books, so I let the matter drop. Nothing else of note occurred that night, and so, making my apologies the next morning, I headed out early towards the old cemetery. I made no secret of my destination, and even offered the opportunity to accompany me to both Wilhelm and Carla, but neither saw the trip as worth the cold hours it would take to reach. So it was alone that I once again made my way to that forgotten place. My marking the trees had proven unnecessary, as there had been no fresh snowfall the previous night, and my footprints from the day before were still clear and very easy to follow. The mausoleum looked exactly as I had left it, its door still yawning, and the sunlight seemed to make it very little distance over the threshold before darkness once again swallowed it. I had foreseen this and packed a lantern for the purpose of exploring the place. I was about to light it when I noticed a figure watching me from the tree line. Perhaps this place was not so forgotten after all. I had heard tales of brigands using places such as this for assignations, and was suddenly glad I had also thought to pack a pistol and shot. I approached the man, but he didn't move to flee. As I got closer, I saw him in more detail. He was short and squat, wearing an old-fashioned black frock coat and knee breeches, though his head was shadowed by a wide-brimmed black hat. By his costume, I assumed him to be an old man, perhaps a groundskeeper for this place, or simply a recluse that lived nearby. When I greeted him, though, the voice that answered held no quiver of age within it. He asked me in low, peasant German whether I was planning to explore the tomb. I said I was, and asked if he was the keeper of the place. He laughed at that, the sharp, guttural exclamation that surprised me, and told me that the crypt I sought was a dangerous place. I asked him what I had to fear from the dead, and he stared at me. I could not see his eyes beneath the brim of his hat, but I could still feel his gaze upon me. He laughed again and told me, "No, sir, you have nothing to fear from the dead." At these words I began to back away, ensuring my hand was on my pistol, not taking my eyes off this strange man until I reached the edge of the mausoleum. Only then did I look down to make sure my lantern was where I left it. And when I returned my gaze to the trees, he was gone. To speak plainly, I was rather shaken by my encounter, and considered turning back and trying my luck another day. But something within me balked at having all my work and preparation be for naught because of a single farmer who couldn't mind his business. I lit my lantern and... Martin, good Lord, man, if you're going to be staying in the archives, at least have the decency to put some trousers on.
Oh, God, sorry. Sorry, I didn't think you were in until later. It's not even 7 yet.
I've been coming in early in the hopes of leaving this place before dark.
Well, it's been a week, and we've seen nothing. Do you really think she's still out there?
I have no idea, but I don't intend to take any chances.
No, I suppose not.
Now, if you'll excuse me.
Righto.
Statement continues. At first I was confused. Inside appeared to be empty. No monuments or coffins stood inside, and no plaques or sigils adorned the wall. Just a single slab of marble stood in the center, like an altar. At first I thought that perhaps that was where the coffin should have sat, and someone had simply taken it. But as I walked around, I saw what it was concealing. Behind the sharp-angled block was a staircase, descending deep into some unknown subterranean vault. You will scoff at me, Jonah, when next we meet, I am sure of it. You will laugh at my bravado and call me an unthinking adventurer, but the plain fact of it is that I descended those stairs with hardly a qualm. Any fear I might have had was solely focused on the man I had met outside, and I foresaw no danger within the vault itself. So I hoisted my lantern, and I descended the stairs. They were old, of that there is no doubt, but they were not worn, and I would wager that I was the first soul to go down there in at least a century. They descended for some time, until I was quite certain that I was deep within the frozen earth of the Schwarzwald. At last the steps ended in a short corridor, and I could see the bricks that formed the walls and arched ceiling had crumbled and shifted in places, allowing ingress to the thick roots of the trees above, which coiled and splayed across those parts of the passage in most need of repair. After about a minute of walking, the passage opened out into a large chamber. In the center stood another block of marble, almost identical to the one I had seen upstairs. But atop this one was a sealed stone coffin. The name Johann von Württemberg was carved here too, though preserved in much clearer detail without the elements to wear it away. As I gazed at it, I noticed that the wall of the room did not appear to be stone, as the passage or the mausoleum had been. I walked cautiously closer, until my lantern illuminated it clearly. The walls were covered with bookshelves, packed in with such a density that it was impossible to tell if there was a real wall behind them, or if the books themselves formed the only bulwark against the soil. They were, unfortunately, terribly rotten. The centuries had not been kind to them, and as I tried to move one of them, I realized that the damp had, over time, caused them to merge into a single mass of paper and book-cloth. Predictable as this may have been, I still felt the most acute pang of loss. To see such a volume of knowledge, possibly unique in all the world, utterly destroyed, was incredibly painful to me. The actual shelves were formed of the same marble as the two blocks, and seemed to have fared better. As I looked at them, I noticed a small engraving, carved at regular intervals along the edge of each one. It was a small eye, open and staring. For some reason, it was only at that moment that I began to feel afraid. Of what, I couldn't tell you, but those small eyes filled me with a dread that I have trouble describing to you now. Certainly I backed away from the bookshelves and was all set to depart when my lantern caught on something in the corner of the room, or more precisely two things. The first was a small gold coin that glinted on the floor. The second was a book, perhaps fallen from the shelves long ago. It was in far better condition than the others, perhaps due to where it had lain, and I was able to very carefully open it. I was disappointed to see that it was not written in German or even French or Latin, but appeared to be in Arabic. It seemed to be an illuminated manuscript of sorts, produced by hand and utterly beautiful, though I could not for the life of me have told you what it concerned. I took the book and the coin to study later, and hastily left the vault, the lingering fear making me feel as though some unseen pursuer might come upon me if I hesitated. I drew my pistol as I left the mausoleum, just in case the strange short man from earlier was waiting to accost me. There was no sign of anyone outside in that clear daylight. I hurried back, though I still had many hours before dusk. As I went, I noticed that the snow on the trees was beginning to thaw, and took comfort in the knowledge that Carla and myself would likely be able to return to Closen soon. Wilhelm was fully recovered from his fever, and by the time I was at dinner, all traces of my earlier fear had disappeared, and I was in excellent spirits. I retired afterwards to smoke a pipe or two, and examine my finds at greater length. The book, though beautiful, stubbornly refused to offer up any clues to its contents. With your permission, I'll bring it over for your expert eyes next time I have the pleasure of your company. The coin, on the other hand, was more interesting. On one side it had an engraved profile of a sharp-faced young man with long, flowing hair. Over the top ran the letters J.W., and at the bottom was the number 1279. If this was the date the coin was produced, then I don't need to tell you how exciting a find this might be. The other side was blank, save for 3 words, very small and worn, but I could just about read them. They read, "Für die Stille." I was about to retire to bed when one of the serving girls, Hilda, or was it Helga, I forget, asked me for a moment of my time, I obliged, and she said had I been asking about the old graveyard out in the forest. I told her yes, I had, and she paled ever so slightly. She told me that she never went near the place, that no one in the town did. You see, Jonah, apparently there was an old man in Schramberg by the name of Tobias Kohler. He had lived nearly 80 years and told tales of when he was a child, and he and his friends would play a game they called Johann's Steps. It was a game of bravery, where you had to creep down as many steps as you could into the tomb of Johann von Württemberg until you were seen, and then run back out as fast as you could. Tobias would never say who or what you were seen by, and always ignored the question. Well, apparently the parents of these children found out about this game, and one of them, the mother of Tobias's friends Hans Winkler, decided to put an end to it. She stormed into the cemetery, and, seeing Hans entering the museum for his turn, she ran inside after him and down the steps. None of the children saw what happened, but they all heard the scream. They fled back to town, and when they told of what had happened, the town priest, whose name Tobias does not remember, simply nodded, and gathering up 6 strong, though deeply fearful men, they headed out towards the cemetery. None of that party ever spoke of what they saw or found there, but Hans went to live with the Becker family out on their small farm. No one played Johann's Steps again, and the cemetery was once again left deserted. The only other thing Tobias remembered was that he had once heard a great-uncle refer to Johann von Württemberg as Ulrich's bastard, which, if the date on the coin was correct, may be referring to Ulrich I or Ulrich II, but either way that place's history must stretch back almost 600 years. But now I feel I have talked around it long enough. I could fill a dozen more pages with preamble and research, yet none of that is why I have written to you as I have. No, I am writing to you to describe what I saw the last night I stayed at Wilhelm's, the event that led to my and Carla leaving a week earlier than we had planned. It was 3 days after I had heard Tobias's story that it happened. I had packed the coin and the book away in a fit of superstition and had decided to take a short stroll as the sun was setting. It was beautiful. The crimsons of the darkening sky danced upon what snow was left, staining it the deepest red. I walked around the house, smoking my pipe, until I came upon the tracks I had left when heading towards the old graveyard. As the snow melted, it had formed my footprints into packed dirt and ice that almost seemed to glow in the waning daylight. I gazed at them and froze. I had made 2 trips to the mausoleum that winter, and sure enough there were 2 stark sets of footprints heading north. But coming back towards the house, there were 3 sets of footprints. I felt the presence behind me, and I turned around. It was the man from the cemetery. His wide-brimmed hat was removed, and he stared at me. His head was completely bald, and his eyes were missing. They were just empty sockets, but they stared at me. They saw me. Believe or dismiss anything else in my letter as you wish, Jonah, but I swear to you that I stood face to face with a man with no eyes, and he saw me. I backed away too quickly and slipped, falling hard upon the ground. In a second he was above me, and he smiled. He said something to me, but my mind was aflame with panic, and I didn't hear what it was. He reached towards me slowly, insolently, as though he sought to savor this moment and would not be rushed. Then, quite without warning, he stopped. His head snapped up to stare at something like a gun dog that hears a shot. He stood there, hand poised as though in indecision. And then he vanished, as though he had never been there, and I simply lay upon the ground, winded and afraid. Night had fallen by the time I finally pulled myself together enough to run back into the house and begin packing. I told Carla we had to leave as soon as possible, though was vague as to the reasons. I still haven't told her why. How do you tell your wife something like that has happened to you? We took the first coach the following morning and haven't stopped. I didn't even realize the coin was missing until I checked my luggage later. Whether to a light-fingered servant or just my own carelessness, it is gone, so I must apologize that I will not be able to share that particular piece of history with you. I must also apologize for the handwriting. I have been committing this to paper as well as can be done on a long coach journey. Still, I look forward to showing you the book I have acquired, and the revelations you will no doubt glean from it. Yours in trust, Albrecht. Statement ends. Always a treat to find a piece of history tucked into the wrong section of the archive. Still, I can't say I know much about Jonah Magnus or the origins of the Institute, so this is a rather pleasing discovery in some ways. Obviously there isn't much follow-up to be done here, but to slake my own interest I have done a little bit of digging myself, which I include here for completeness' sake. I've only found one reference to any Johann von Württemberg in any of the German history reference material we have available. Jan Moira's Cradle of Germany, Württemberg Through the Centuries, mentions rumors that Ulrich I, Count of Württemberg, had a second son out of wedlock in 1255. No name is listed, but certain enemies of the Count were known to spread rumors that this exiled son was keeping the company of witches. 1279 was also the year that Ulrich I's successor, Ulrich II, died. This may simply have been coincidence, however, as he was succeeded by his half-brother Eberhard I. Something else I stumbled across, quite by accident during my research, was in Grim Tales, H.T. Moncrief's exploration of unexplained and macabre deaths in early 19th century Europe. It mentions a death that took place in Schramberg in 1816. The man, one Rudolf Ziegler, was found dead at his home on the outskirts of town. What is interesting is that it says he worked in service on an estate nearby. Shortly after his death, one Wilhelm von Closen was investigated for the crime, as it was discovered that the dead man had been stealing jewelry from the estate. It was eventually dropped, however, after 4 doctors attested that the ferocity of the wounds inflicted on Herr Ziegler were, and I quote, beyond the capacity of human violence. It was ruled an animal attack. I did try to find out what happened to Albrecht von Closen and his book, but I can find no mention of him in any volume of history, nor anywhere online. Perhaps I might find out more if I spent months sifting through the historical statements in the archive's back rooms, but I simply don't have time to indulge my own curiosity like that. I have located a genealogy for Wilhelm von Closen, though. He married and had children, and the family remained located in and around Schramberg for almost another century, before one branch emigrated to England in 1908. They had a daughter, Elsa, who went on to marry a man by the name of Michael Key in 1920. In 1924, they had one daughter, whose name was Mary Key. This may be simple coincidence, but it concerns me. End recording. Statement of Samson Kempthorne regarding the workhouse architecture of George Gilbert Scott. Original statement given June 12, 1841. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, Head Archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. Dear Jonah, it is my fondest wish that this message should find you in good health, as I have heard more than one mutual acquaintance remark on your current state of overwork. While I earnestly hope it is merely idle gossip, my knowledge of your character leads me to entreat that you allow yourself some respite, or at the very least take some further secretarial staff into your employ,
Certain uncharitable quarters would have it that your life consists of little but rattling around an Edinburgh townhouse surrounded by piles of ghostly accounts and lunatic documentation. Piles, I am afraid to say, to which I am about to make an addition. I would suggest you come visit with myself and Marianne as a diversion, but if you are of a mind to do so, you must travel swiftly. You see, we are shortly to depart for New Zealand, there to start a new life, far from London and its workhouses. And it is this imminent departure that has had such a freeing effect upon my pen. For there are things I have seen which I feel deserve a place among your asylum of letters. They regard the works of my former assistant, George Gilbert Scott, whose own architectural practice is now most respected. I have been fearful that accusations of slander might dog me, were my tale to be set down, but with a boat to the New World beckoning and your sterling reputation for discretion, I feel it may at last be time to divest myself of the disquieting scenes I have witnessed. George came to me in 1834 from his engagement with the office of Henry Roberts, where he was completing his training. Henry himself I have the greatest respect for, as he trained under Sir Robert Smirk, who had received his knighthood not 2 years previous. Henry was very effusive about the talents and prospects of young Mr. Scott, and was at great pains to inform me that his young protégé had also received certain architectural tutelages from Sir Robert himself. He said this with the oddest of looks, as though there was some jolly secret between us. I rather just nodded, as if to say I took his meaning, and he left well enough alone. He even showed me George's work on drafting his plans for the Fishmonger's Hall near London Bridge, which had opened to great acclaim. It certainly seemed clear to me that he would make a fine assistant, at least for as long as I were able to keep him. And so we began our brief collaboration, the subject of which was the workhouse, a topic, as I'm sure you recall, very close to my heart. The plight of the poor and destitute has been a national disgrace for far too long, and when I was handed the task of designing them by the Poor Law Commissioners, it was an undertaking I embarked on with no small amount of zeal. My original designs were intended to assist in the easy segregation of inmates by sex, age, or infirmity, with capacity and utility foremost in my mind. I know many look on the workhouse with disdain, calling it the pauper's Bastille, and seeing very little distinction between the workhouse and the prison. But this is a deeply myopic view to take. The prison keeps its population for the safety and improvement of society at large, while the workhouse exists for the improvement of the inmates themselves. To criticize the conditions as harsh is to overlook the basic moral imperative of work itself, and I firmly believe that to dismiss the punitive as a valid form of moral improvement is to consign many a poor soul to perdition. But I digress, Jonah. I am so used to penning defences of my designs that it seems I can write little which does not do so. It was in his assistance with these designs that George first began to show those peculiarities of character that I would become so ill at ease with. His process redrafting was deeply unsettling. He would spend hours in the office simply staring at the drawings, saying nothing, taking no food or drink, and ignoring any inquiry or interruption. Then, in a single move, he would gather up all the papers and retire to his private office, locking the door behind him. Then, from the other side of that firm oak door, I would hear the strangest sounds, muttering and shouting. It was always in George's voice alone. I could never quite discern the words. It often sounded as though he were in some great distress, and on more than one occasion I was within minutes of summoning a constable to assist in breaking through the door, when he would emerge, glistening from exertion and holding completely redone drawings. I'm sure I even saw blood on his collar once. The designs themselves were little better. He would take the solid functionality of my original plans and remake them in all sorts of odd symmetries which, while architecturally intriguing, generally sacrificed many practical considerations. He also, without fail, made everything closer. Passageways would be narrowed and sleeping quarters shrunk, until a building designed to hold 300 paupers would be remade to house almost twice that number. As I mentioned before, I have no objection to harsh conditions within the workhouse to dissuade the idle from taking residence there, but the cramped plans that George would present me bordered upon the claustrophobic, and I was generally unable to use them. Each time I told him so, his face would tighten in momentary anger, and his lips would go white. Then I would watch as he took that rage and discarded it, once again becoming the genial, if somewhat serious, young man I had first met. It was an odd sight. When his father died in 1834, it came as no great surprise to me that he chose to resign from my service. He told me he considered it necessary to become the provider for his family, though I have my suspicions he was also eager to no longer have his designs subject to my scrutiny. I wished him well, naturally, but could not honestly say I was not somewhat relieved by his departure. It was shortly after this I received an invitation to a small social gathering hosted by Henry Roberts. It was there that I met Sir Robert Smirk. He was a tall man, with sharp, almost saturnine features and eyes that seemed to regard you in ratios and pounds of raw material. He was polite and gregarious, but I found him difficult to talk to at length, as he seemed to be forever further ahead in the conversation than I was, and I could never be sure whether or not I was boring him. When I realized that George was not present, and there was no sign of his imminent arrival, I resolved to raise the matter with Sir Robert, regarding what exactly his tutelage had entailed. At the mention of the name George Gilbert Scott, Sir Robert's face flushed suddenly, with anger in a manner not entirely unlike that of his protégé. He asked me what my interest was in Mr. Scott, and I told him that he had, until recently, been engaged as my assistant. At this, Sir Robert gave a small laugh of satisfaction, and told me I did not realize exactly how lucky an escape I may have had. I asked again what exactly his training had entailed, and Sir Robert stared at me for a silent minute, before he finally nodded his head. Balance, he told me. Equilibrium, the hardest thing for an architect to achieve. Symmetry is easy, but does not in and of itself result in balance. To stir the feelings of man, to create a small place of being, divorced from the rest of the world, while still retaining that balance, is the true goal of the architect. I had never heard my profession talked of with such conviction and fire before, and I will not lie to you, Jonah, the look in his eyes when he spoke scared me. Without prompting, his tirade continued, and he began to talk about George, about shortcuts and symmetry, and a patron that the young fool did not understand. I could follow very little of it, and it seemed to be decidedly removed from anything that I would consider architecture, but whatever it was that Sir Robert had been teaching George, it appeared the lessons had been put to less noble use than he had intended. It was at this point that Henry noticed Sir Robert's agitation from across the room and came over to gently usher him away to the smoking room. He sent me a glance of mild reproach as he led his mentor away, and I was left standing there in the middle of the room, utterly confused and rather shaken. I resolved to avoid, where possible, having anything further to do with George, and continued with my own works. I heard he had set himself up with the construction of workhouses according to his own designs. He had taken on a partner by the name of William Bonathan Moffat, a builder's son with no moral character to recommend him of any sort. They vigorously canvassed several district guardians, and managed to acquire several commissions that had previously been mine. Needless to say, I was rather taken aback by this utter lack of professional etiquette, but I was not without other projects, so I endeavoured to ignore it, and leave him to whatever squalid interments he cared to build. It was in September of '36 that it happened, shortly after George and Moffat had finally opened the first of their workhouses. I didn't realize that was what had happened until afterwards, ensconced as I had been in my own work. Darkness had fallen, and still I was busy, lit by the reassuring glow of a dozen candles. There was no clock in the workshop, a deliberate choice to stop the lateness of the hour disturbing me, but I suspect it to have been somewhere past midnight when I heard them. Footsteps. Heavy, thudding footsteps, and the click-clack of a sturdy cane. My assistants had locked all the doors when they left for the evening, and through the silence of my study I could not have missed the sound of them opening again. To my dying day, Jonah, I will aver that no one entered the building before I heard the footsteps approach. As their heavy tread grew closer and the clack of the cane struck louder, with a quiet malice, I heard another sound beneath them. The jangle of keys. I have never in all of my life been possessed by such a fear as I was then. The walls and floor seemed to rise towards me, stealing the air from my lungs until I swear that I could feel the splinters from the ceiling digging into the soft skin of my face. I couldn't move as the thudding boot tread came to a halt outside the door, and the cane came to rest with a final clack. I waited. I waited to have the last vestiges of life squeezed from me by whatever this was. I don't know how much time passed, and then, as though suddenly sloughing off a heavy cloak, the weight fell from me. The room returned to its natural proportions, which is to say it never truly changed, I think. It is hard to describe exactly, Jonah, so you will forgive my vagaries. I rose to my feet, and in a moment of foolhardy bravery that I doubt I shall ever truly understand, I grabbed a candle and ran to the door, flinging it open. I saw a figure walking away through the door to one of the clerk's offices. It was short and wide, and I could see the wood of the floor bow beneath its huge boots. It wore a tall black hat, and only the thinnest wisps of grey hair were visible below. In its coarse, ruddy hand it held a hard-worn black cane tipped with iron. Then the door closed behind it and it was gone. I followed into the room behind it, but it was empty. There was no sign of the man or whatever it was that had gone in before me. The window was sealed, and there was nowhere for someone of that size to hide. Still I searched. I wasn't sure what else to do. Even the heavy boot prints seemed to have vanished. What I did manage to find, however, fallen behind one of the writing desks, was one of George Gilbert Scott's workhouse designs. There is, of course, no way to be certain of any connection between the two events, but that did little to quell the scalding rage in my breast as I strode out of my door the next morning. I took a cab to George's office, where I was informed that he was at his workhouse site with Moffat, and took another cab. I found the site in a state of some commotion, with my former assistant standing next to a high stone wall, arguing with a labourer who seemed quite distraught. He was gesturing wildly at an area of the wall, while another man, who I assumed to be Moffat, tried to calm him down. As I approached, I began to make out what the labourer was saying. He was asking after someone he referred to as the governor, while Moffat was trying very patiently to explain that no governor had yet been appointed to the workhouse. The labourer didn't seem to be paying this point much mind, however. He kept repeating that the governor had come to see Harry. He did not say who Harry was, but I assume an acquaintance of his. He said he knew it was the governor because of the jangle of his keys. He said that the governor had called Harry idle. It was at this point I was finally close enough to see the wall he was pointing at with such excitement. At first I thought they were worms, small and pale against the brickwork, but as I got closer I saw them clearly. Extending from the unblemished, solid stone of the workhouse wall were 4 fingertips. The labourer repeated it again. The governor had called Harry idle. I returned to George's documents and left. I trust you will understand now, Jonah, why I have been avoiding the company of my fellows these last few years. I have always been reluctant to make any notation of my story, but now that I finally have everything prepared for my move to New Zealand, I would feel like I had slighted you had I left without sharing my tale. Do with it as you will. I am done with it. Sincerely yours, Samson Kempthorne. End statement. Obviously, trying to trace disappearances and deaths in Victorian workhouses is an exercise in futility, so I'm loath to even try. More importantly, who is Robert Smirk? I've read every book I can find on the man, which is admittedly not many, and none of them show any sign of this other side to him, apparently at the heart of strange buildings and architecture all over London. And now what? Students? Apprentices? If Henry Roberts was a student of some sort of paranormal construction methods, it doesn't appear to show up in any of his buildings, save perhaps for Fishmongers' Hall, which he designed along with Sir George Gilbert Scott for the Worshipful Company of Fishmongers in 1834. It is reportedly a hotbed for low-key hauntings, but nothing of the magnitude we've heard from others. Scott is concerning, however. While Smirk seems to have built a handful of notable buildings around London, Sir George Gilbert Scott is responsible for landmarks such as St Pancras Station, the Albert Memorial, and the restoration of Westminster Abbey. If his buildings have similar quirks, then, well, to be honest, I don't know what that would mean, but I doubt it would be good. That said, there have been no reports of any sort of paranormal or supernatural disturbance in any still-standing building designed by Scott. That should make me feel better, but somehow it doesn't. End recording. I'm sorry?
Are you in trouble?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, there was a policewoman asking after you. You know, the one who came to look into Gertrude.
Basira. When was this?
Yesterday. You were at physical therapy.
Did she say why?
No. It was a bit weird, really. I've seen her around here a few times before, actually. I don't trust her.
Sorry, what?
Well, I asked if she had anything new to report on Gertrude, and she just said no, and then mumbled a question about when you'd be back. Then she left. It was weird. She's weird.
You don't have a problem with the police, do you, Tim?
Well, you do know I'm the finest cat burglar in all of Bromley.
Tim.
Okay, so seriously, I don't get why she keeps coming back round here outside of the investigation.
She's, I'm helping her with some of the investigation. Off the record.
Oh, say no more.
Tim, what are you...
Don't worry. I'm cool. Good work, boss.
Oh, no, Tim, that's...
I'll go see
not what
if I can dig anything else out on
It's
Scott,
really
and I'll
not
let you
like-
know if she comes back.
Yeah, that really isn't my... End supplemental.
What's your emergency?
Police, please.
Hello.
Yes, I'm calling to report a crime in progress.
Sir, are you in any immediate personal danger?
Yes, not immediately, but I will be shortly.
Sir, where are you calling from?
Could I speak to your chief inspector, please? Tell her Elias Bouchard is calling, of the Magnus Institute.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Chief Inspector Calgary.
Yes. Good afternoon. Sorry to bother you. I believe you're looking for Detective Alice Tonner.
Do you know where she is?
I do, yes. She should be here in about 15 minutes.
I'll send some officers over immediately.
That will be wonderful. Much appreciated. Statement of Barnabas Bennett, as given in a short letter to Jonah Magnus, April 9th, 1824. My dear Jonah, you must help me. If anyone is still here, it is you. I know your work brings you into contact with all sorts of fantastical terrors, so perhaps you might have it within your power to save me from this place. And it was you who warned me not to cross Mordecai Lucas, advice that I have, I'm afraid, disregarded. It was a small enough thing, as I believed, a trifling debt I fell behind on, and when he met me in that garden, quiet as it is always with him, he demanded repayment. Well, I took it poorly, and laughed at his insistence. Bring it before the courts, I told him. After all, what judge would find in his favour over mine? He simply regarded me silently for many minutes, staring with such a cast to his face that I could feel my resolution beginning to falter. You shall pay me, he said at last, in kind. Then he walked away. Let me tell you, Jonah, I believed myself profoundly lucky that day as my hansom deposited me on the steps of my townhouse, a mood only slightly shaken by the impression that as the cab pulled away, it seemed to have no driver that I could discern. I am lucky, Jonah, but only insofar as that I never married, never fathered children, never let anyone get closer than my brother. The pangs of loneliness I feel are no more acute than my general longing for the company of my fellow man. I have no one whose absence truly pains me. And yet here, in this empty world, I cannot but spend these nights, these dreadful silent nights, huddled and frozen in some terrible fear I find myself unable to name. I almost think I hear the mocking joy of my friends, but there is nobody here, and never shall be again. I try to read, to lose myself in something that is not the absence of humanity. How is it that the books speak to me of my isolation more acutely than the silence? For every treatise I read on this world and its workings, the more I know I am to spend my time left in it without comfort or reprieve. With every tale of love or society, I feel more keenly the absence of both. I went to Egypt once with the Royal Society, to the Temple of Ramses II in Abu Simbel. The place was remarkable, of course, but what sticks so keenly in my mind is the journey. 2 days earlier, on the road from Aswan, I found myself separated from my fellow travellers. I do not know how it happened, but I spent 2 hours alone there, under the blazing sun, staring across the vast, empty expanses of that ancient country. I revelled in the silence then, embraced the loneliness like an old friend, but now that friend has devoured me, and I shall not emerge from its jaws. Not without your help. And you must help me, Jonah. If anyone knows of what might break me from this dreadful place, it is you. I know that what is done by those I cannot see might be felt here. I have found glasses broken and pages torn that were not so the night before. It is my hope that if I leave a letter here in your institute, you might find it. You might be able to save me. I have no other hope. Please, Jonah, if you have any compassion within your heart, you will not leave me in this place. Your loyal servant, Barnabas. Jonah Magnus did leave him in that place, John. He got the letter, oh yes, and was on good terms with Mordecai Lucas. He could have interceded, perhaps even saved him, but he did not. And it was not out of malice, or because he lacked affection for Barnabas Bennett. He retrieved those bones sadly enough when the time came. Bones that you can still find in my office, if you know where to look. No, it was because he was curious, because he had to know, to watch and see it all. That's what this place is, John. Never forget it. You may believe yourself to have friends, to have confidants, but in the end, all they are is something for you to watch, to know, and ultimately to discard. This, at least, Gertrude understood. Let us begin.
Sorry to interrupt. John's here, and he seems angry. I actually think he's brought a
Bouchard. Easy.
Hello, Elias.
Goodness, John. Whatever happened to your hand? And your neck?
That one was me.
You look a mess.
I've had a hell of a week.
Martin, would you be so good as to fetch Melanie and Tim? I think it would be worth their time to be here.
Right. Okay, I'll just... go then?
Okay, let's do this.
John, do you want to get this on tape?
No need, Basira. I've already got one running. Now, you have something to ask me?
Go for it.
Before I strangle the grinning bastard.
Elias, did you kill Gertrude Robinson and Leitner?
That's quite nice, actually. Tingly, but sort of freeing. You know, even Gertrude never properly tried to compel me. I always wondered.
Just answer the question.
Oh, don't.
Oh, no need to worry about that. I just feel it's only fair to wait for your colleagues, John. They'll want to hear this too. It's also very important to me, in a personal capacity, that you understand I'm answering you of my own free will.
I don't care.
I know, but I do. There's so much of this place, and of ourselves, twisted by forces far beyond us. I just wanted you to know.
Okay, so I've got everyone, but I'm honestly kind of
Yeah,
lost as to what's happening.
Oh, Christ, what is it now?
Yes, same question, please.
Elias here is about to confess his crimes.
What?
Oh, good.
Is that like a...
Yes, I was just saying to John, it's very important to me that you understand that no action I have taken has been controlled. I have done everything because I wished to.
Get to the point.
Of course, Detective. So, for the avoidance of any doubt, I killed Gertrude Robinson because she intended to destroy the archives, and I killed Jürgen Leitner because he was an unnecessary complication, likely to tell John too much too early.
Bloody hell!
Oh, no.
Sorry. That guy was Jürgen Leitner.
It was.
Daisy, where do I know that name from?
Oh, the Yusuf case, An Introduction to Higher Anatomy.
Oh. Oh, God. And you killed him. You sure shouldn't be giving him a medal.
Very sure.
And Sasha? Did you kill her too?
Sasha died almost a year ago, Martin.
What?
Oh, God.
When Prentice attacked something else, it replaced her. I still don't know how, but
God damn it, this is...
It wasn't Sasha.
He's right, Martin. The thing you remember as Sasha was nothing like her. It toyed with your memory. If I showed you a picture of the real Sasha now, you'd have no idea who it was.
So that thing we saw.
Precisely. It finally tried to kill John, then Leitner killed it, then I killed Leitner. And I believe that brings us up to date, more or less.
What about Michael?
What about him? An irritant, interfering because he's bored and he resents us. He has no
Right,
purpose.
that's enough for me. Even got it on tape. Everyone get back.
What?
Daisy, wait.
Out the way.
Now, hang on. I thought you were about
Get
to arrest
out the way.
John, do something!
Don't.
Excuse me. Yes?
Elias, there's some police officers here to see you.
Yes. Thank you, Rosie. Could you ask them to wait a minute or two?
Yep, will do.
There. That should make it even easier for you, right, Detective? I know you were planning to kill me, but surely an arrest is a consolation prize.
Daisy?
Oh, didn't she tell you why she hadn't gone back to the station? Allow me. She rightly suspected that I held evidence of various murders she had committed, and that I sent this to her superiors. She's quite the killer, your partner. All in the public good, of course. And she was correct. I spent some time acquiring that evidence, or creating it. And while your superiors don't much care about the killings, the fact there is proof, they're not happy. And they want you brought in.
So, I kill you and go to jail. I'll take that deal.
For someone who used to be a detective, you're remarkably reluctant to think things through. You think you're the only police officer eager to do violence and call it justice? No. There are plenty of other rabid dogs out there, mad with the hunt, and some of them have signed a Section 31. There are plenty of others your superiors can call on to clean up this mess.
No, they wouldn't.
Yeah, they would.
And anyone close enough to be implicated, they will kill Basira.
Okay, wait. That's the police that you're talking about, okay? They wouldn't. Would they?
I'm sorry, Basira.
Yeah.
If the officers down there take you away... But perhaps I was wrong when I called them. Maybe it was a false alarm.
What do you want?
Collateral.
That... what?
A contract of employment for Basira.
What?
Sign it, and I'll send your ex-colleagues on their way.
Basira,
Don't do it.
There.
Damn it.
False alarm, Rosie. Could you apologise to the officers for me and thank them for their time?
Oh, all right.
So... what? You're her boss now? Is that supposed to stop me?
Yes.
I mean, she's still got a gun.
Of course. Sometimes I forget how new you all are to this. Basira is now tied to the Institute. All of you are. Like fingers on a hand, and I am the beating heart of it. Should I, or the Institute be destroyed, you will all, unfortunately, follow suit.
Wait, what?
Yep, that sounds about right.
And it would not be a pleasant death.
Bullshit!
Then shoot me. Just squeeze the trigger and watch the only person you care about die screaming. Your last connection to humanity. Do it.
Daisy.
What do you want?
The police are not the only ones who can find a use for your violence. I'm sure there'll be plenty here for you to do. Feel free to go where you like in the meantime. I'll be in touch.
You piece of...
Daisy, it's okay. We'll figure something out.
This is insane.
You get used to it.
Now that's taken care of, if you'll all give me and John a moment alone, I'm sure we have some things to discuss.
Yeah.
Come on. So,
Come on, John. There's really no need for the scowl.
what do you want?
Honestly, to offer some congratulations. You're doing a lot better than I expected.
Feels like all I've managed to do is not die.
And believe me, that is a remarkably rare skill.
I'm not getting any answers out of this, am I?
The easily digestible sort that wipe away any doubt and fear and neatly organise your new world into happy little columns? No, not from me. These are things you must discover on your own.
Why?
What are you?
The Archivist.
Precisely. It is your job to chronicle these things, to experience them, whether first-hand or through the eyes of others. To simply be told that, well...
It doesn't please your master.
Our master, John.
I never chose this.
You never wanted this, no. But I'm afraid you absolutely did choose it. In 100 ways, at 100 thresholds, you pressed on. You sought knowledge relentlessly, and you always chose to see. Our world is made of choices, John, and very rarely do we truly know what any of them mean. But we make them nonetheless.
So what now?
You were doing fine before you forced this little scene. I suggest you continue.
So it was you sending me the statements?
A little bit of direction never hurt anybody, so to speak.
Directed towards what?
The unknowing. I need you to stop it.
Again with... What is the unknowing, exactly?
A ritual. The stranger and its kin attempting to gather power enough to bring it closer.
They're trying to, what, summon it?
Not exactly. These things that touch us, they don't have a form of the sort that could exist in physical reality, so the stranger wishes to remake that physical reality into something closer to itself. It wants to make this world its own.
And how do I stop it?
That is what you need to find out.
No, you are not doing that. I know you have Gertrude's notes, her files. She was working on a way to stop this. Not to mention that apparently you can effortlessly see anything at any time.
Hardly effortlessly, but I take your point.
So obviously you know how to stop it. You could just tell me.
I could. But I believe that if I did so, you would fail. The stranger is antithetical to us. We thrive on ceaseless watching, on knowing too much. What we face is the hidden, the uncanny, and the unknown. If you were to stop them, you need to get better at seeing. And my explaining things is simply not enough.
And you can't just give me all the statements.
John, even when you had all of them at your disposal, you barely got through one statement a week. Why do you think that is? It takes its toll on you, and I know you have had problems with moderation.
So it's back to breadcrumbs and statements and risking my life talking to things that barely remember how to be human anymore.
For now. I'll be in touch. Anything else?
Elias, am I still human?
John, what does human even mean? I mean, really. You still bleed, you can still die. And your will is still your own, mostly. That's more that can be said for a lot of the real humans out there. You're worried about ending up like that thing lurking in the dirt under the streets of Alexandria. Don't be. Just do what you need to do and you'll be fine. Understood?
I suppose so.
Good. Well, I have work to be getting on with. I'll send you a return to work form, but don't worry about the doctor's note. Now, if there's nothing else...
Right. Statement of Dr. Jonathan Fanshawe regarding the months leading up to the death and autopsy of Albrecht von Closen. Original statement given as part of a letter to Jonah Magnus, November 21st, 1831. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, the Archivist. Statement begins. Jonah, I must first and foremost decline your generous offer of a medical position servicing Millbank Penitentiary. While the terms you have laid out are, no doubt, more than adequate, I have, of these last months, come to the unfortunate conclusion that our intimacy and friendship must cease immediately. I do not know what interest you have in the poor condemned souls within those walls, nor do I care to guess. In the light of what I have so recently witnessed, I can no longer in good conscience associate with any of your endeavours, nor will I continue to collect or provide those accounts of the esoteric and otherworldly that you and your Institute so eagerly require. Consider this the severing of our acquaintance. This cannot come as a shock to you. Surely you must have understood what you were asking when you implored me to visit with Albrecht, and apply my meagre skills to the illness that beset him. You must have known the nature of that illness, even if only in the most general terms, and no doubt you had some intuition as to its cause. But should all this be a true surprise to you, then I shall do my best to explain, and hope that any revelations contained herein may sway you from the path you have started upon. I arrived at Albrecht's estate early in April. The trees were dense with renewed greenery, and the rain drummed heavily on the carriages as we approached. I remember it so clearly. The smell of the rain cut through with an unexpected whiff of smoke, and as we got closer I saw the orange glow of flame through the trees. My first thought was that the house had caught fire, and I would arrive only to a scorched ruin and blackened bone, but as we got closer I could see that it was a single tree that was burning, a gnarled and ancient elm that sat removed from the rest of the forest. A small crowd surrounded the spectacle. One man, who I took to be a groundskeeper, stood closer than the others, with a lit torch in his hand. On my instruction, the driver pulled closer, though the horses were nervous, and I asked the man why they were burning the tree when the rain was coming down so heavily. Surely it could have waited for drier weather. The man simply shrugged. My German is fine, though I have had little cause to use it of late, but his accent was thick, and all that I could get from him was a sense of resignation, and the insistence that his master, who I took to be Albrecht, wanted the tree dead. I am sure that he used that word, though, not burned, not removed or destroyed. Dead. I resolved to ask Albrecht about it when I saw him. As it transpired, that was some time later than I had anticipated. As I'm sure you're aware, Albrecht's wife Carla was taken by a fever some years ago, and his sons were away at school, so it was the housekeeper who greeted me when I arrived. Greta, her name was, a pleasant, red-faced young woman with a smattering of English that she insisted on using at every opportunity. Once I dressed in dry clothes, she brought some food and a drop of brandy, all the while making apologies that the master of the house was indisposed. I did tell her that I was a doctor, and specifically visiting in order to help end any indisposition, but she just shook her head and told me he'd see me when he was ready. The house seemed so empty. The rain battered on the window and the clocks ticked away in every room, but there seemed no sound of life to be found anywhere. As I sat in the drawing room, I realized Greta had left the door behind me open to the corridor beyond. I tried to ignore it, simply drink my brandy and continue waiting, but I could not ignore the sensation that someone was out there, watching behind me. The corridor was dark, and I thought for a second I could make out a shape crouched there. But there was nothing, so I closed the door. Eventually evening came, and Greta informed me that dinner was served. I ate alone, sat in a long dining hall that seemed to have far too many windows. Turning behind me, I saw Greta watching me from the doorway. Her face held nothing of malice in it that I could discern, but still I was uneasy. I called, trying to dismiss her, but she didn't seem to hear me. I retired back to the drawing room to smoke my pipe, but even that simple, reassuring action brought me no comfort, and I made my way to the room I had been given without ever once having seen my elusive host. I noted that the window looking over my bed had neither blind nor shutter, and I was all at once very aware of my candle, and the sickly illumination it spread over everything. The point of light reflected back in the glass like the glint of an eye. I did not sleep well that night. The feeling of being under observation did not lessen, and I remained unsure of the exact nature of this errand, an errand, I remind you, Jonah, I undertook at your insistence. Eventually a fitful sleep found me, and I had some measure of peace. It was still dark when I awoke, and that feeling had intensified to a terrifying measure. I was now certain that something was in the room with me, staring at me. I reached over and took a match, striking it against the bedpost. And there, looming over me, was a face, pale and shaking. The eyes were sunken, and the cheeks were dirty and unshaved. It was the face of Albrecht von Closen. In the light, his eyes met mine, and his mouth began to work furiously, repeating the same phrase over and over, increasing in volume until he was screaming it into my face. Leg sie alle zurück! Leg sie alle zurück! Put them back. Put them back. I felt a sharp pain in my fingers as the match burnt down, and I dropped it with a cry. The room disappeared into darkness once again, and when my scrabbling hands had gotten another lit, he was gone, and I was alone. I did not sleep any further that night. When the sun finally crept through my uncovered window, I dressed quickly. Greta's pleas that I come down for breakfast were roundly ignored, and I started throwing open any door I had not yet seen behind, looking for my host. I found him in the library, where a fire already blazed in a feeble attempt to keep the morning chill at bay. He stood in front of it, eyes lost in the flame, looking every bit as feeble and worn as he had when he crouched over my bed the night before. I shut the door behind me, before Greta could object, and demanded to know why he had come into my room. He apologized, in such a pitiful tone that the anger seemed to abandon me all at once. He seemed so small. He gestured for me to take a seat, and I did. As he walked the shelves, stroking the spines of each book in turn, I started to ask him about his health, and explained why I was there, but he showed not the slightest sign that he was listening. I had them rebound last year, he said. Damp can do terrible things to a book. I told him I was certain that was the case, but I must insist we talk about his health. Again he ignored me. Instead, he took the seat opposite me and started to tell me a story, and then another, and another. A stream of strange tales began to pour out of him, and I just sat there, transfixed, desperately wishing I had the strength of will to stand and leave, but all I could do was listen. He told me of a seamstress who laced her body with fine black thread, and when she pulled it all out in a single swift motion, her skin dropped away like a loose shift. He told me of a man so scared to die, he spent a year weaving a rope blindfolded, so that he would not know the length, and could not foresee the moment it would tighten around his neck when he finally threw himself into the void. He told me of a fire that burns so hot and fierce that to even know about it is enough to burn a man's tongue from his head. He told me so many terrible things. And at the end of it all, the only thing I could think to ask him was where he read them. My eyes darted to the books that surrounded us, but Albrecht laughed at this and placed his hands across a spine that was simply labelled a warning. For a moment, he looked as though he were about to wrench it from its place and hurl it into the fire, but it passed. He turned back to me. "You do not understand," he said to me in German. "I do not read the books. They read me." I did not ask him to clarify further. I got the key to my room from Greta and made sure, this time, that the door was locked as I slept. As my stay progressed, I learned more of his condition. I would have initially described it as a natural mania that had found a totemic focus on the books of his library. But when he finally told me the story of how he discovered them, and the awful tomb from which they were retrieved, I began to suspect that perhaps the books had brought some contaminant into Albrecht's home, which had gradually corroded his mind. I had neither the time nor equipment to conduct the sort of tests that might have confirmed such things, but I became convinced that removing the books would go some way to addressing his health concerns. I expected some stiff resistance on the subject, but Albrecht's response seemed closer to relief than any sort of distress. He simply asked if I would help, and to my eternal regret, I agreed. What shall I tell you, Jonah, about this fool's errand, that damnable journey we embarked upon? Shall I regale you with the awful experiences of transporting a library's worth of books through the Black Forest? Perhaps I should write you an in-depth account of finding that ancient cemetery, of descending into that bleak and frozen mausoleum. Or would you prefer to hear about the hours we spent placing volume after volume on empty grey shelves, ignoring how out of place the new bindings appeared against the antique stonework? No. I'm sure all you want to know was how Albrecht died. Why it was that as I replaced the last book taken from that place, I heard his scream from the top of the stairs and ran up to find him sprawled and dead before the stone coffin. But I cannot answer that. I do not know how he died. I saw nothing and no one with him, and his body seemed whole and undamaged. But I do have some idea as to why it happened. For as I filled those dead shelves with freshly bound volumes, I could not help but notice that every page was blank. I have since checked with Paynes, who I believe to be your preferred bookbinders, and I know that the books poor Albrecht was returning to the grave were not the books that were taken. I hope they bring you much wisdom, Jonah, for the cost was dear enough. Nothing stood in the way of my retreat, and I dragged Albrecht's body back as far as the coach. We left that awful place, and I have endeavoured most acutely to forget the route. Before he was buried, I was able to secure permission to perform an autopsy. I had some thought as to discovering the cause of his sudden, violent passing. Do I need to tell you what I found, Jonah? Do I need to detail what covered his organs, his bones, the inside of his skin? What clustered together in their dozens and all turned as one to focus on me as I opened his chest, their pupils constricting in the light, with irises of every hue and colour. Because whatever it was that did this to him, I know in my heart that it is your fault. I have had the body burned. Please do not write to me again. Your obedient servant, Dr. Jonathan Fanshawe. Statement ends. Disconcerting to find my namesake in a statement, especially one connected so directly to the Institute. I can only hope breaking faith with Jonah Magnus didn't go too badly for him. Jonah Magnus. I've never really given much thought to him, not nearly as much as I should have. I suppose I had always hoped there was a chance he was innocent in all this. I know, but I just hoped that maybe the founding of the Institute was in earnest, and not simply the foundation stone for all the terrible things that have happened here. But no, whatever is happening now has its origins 200 years ago, in the work of an evil man. Exactly 200 years, in fact. Don't think that little detail has evaded me. I don't know the precise date the Institute was founded, but I do know that it was in 1818. Something's coming. I know it is. But I just don't know what I need to do. Now, come in, Becerra.
I was waiting for you to finish.
I know.
I don't like that you started doing that.
I know. How's Melanie?
How do you think?
I should probably talk
You should
to...
probably stay as far away as possible. She doesn't want to see you.
No, of course. She has...
But she did want me to apologise from her for the shoulder.
Oh, it's fine. Scalpel wounds, they heal quickly. Too quickly, really.
Already?
Just another scar for the collection. Do you think it worked? Is she...
I don't know. She seems more coherent, I guess. And she did get an apology.
Yeah.
She says she can cry now, which is, progress, I think. She's still angry, but she hasn't attacked anyone. Not even sure she has it in her anymore.
Well, that's good.
So, you can't be killed by a collapsing building. Major injuries scar up fast. You can force the truth out of people, and knowledge pops into your head whenever you need it.
Yes, I think that about covers it.
And what was that you were doing yesterday?
When?
You were sat on the floor for like 4 hours.
Oh, no, I was listening. You know, trying to see if any of the statements called to me.
And? Brilliant.
Look, I don't know, Basira. I hope I'm still human, but it's seeming more and more unlikely.
I didn't ask.
No, I suppose you didn't.
Don't snoop in my head.
I'm not snooping. I'm not looking. That's not how this works.
Explain it, then.
I'm not sure I can.
Humour me.
It's hard. It's like there's a door in my mind, and behind it is the entire ocean. Before, I didn't notice it, but now I know it's there, and I can't forget it, and I can feel the pressure of the water on it. I can keep it closed, but sometimes when I'm around people or places or ideas, a drop or two will push through the cracks at the edges of the door, and I'll know something.
What happens if you open the door?
I drown. I'm sorry, Basira. I will try to keep anything I learn about you to myself. My priorities haven't changed. I hope you can believe that. I'm still on your side. You can trust me.
Yeah. People keep saying that.
Do they? Who else? Did Martin say something?
It was a few months back, after the attack. He'd started spending time with Lucas. At least, he said he was. And I wanted answers. He kept telling me to trust him, to hear the guy out, even though he still wouldn't actually show his face. I told him he could drop me an email or vanish me.
Right.
Honestly, I kind of regret not just grabbing Martin and shaking an explanation out of him. But I didn't want to push it. He was in a bad place, what with the attack and his mum and everything, so I didn't press it. Now I try and bring it up. He just disappears. Nothing to be done.
So, sorry, you said... What happened with his mother?
Oh, yeah. She died. About 2 months after you, Martin was... He tried to stay strong, keep it together, but that sort of thing. Then those flesh things burst in, and well, here we are.
God.
He didn't tell you?
No.
Guess you don't know everything, then.
No, I guess not. So what do we do now?
You tell me. Just don't expect much on trust these days.
Yes, I suppose that's fair.
Good evening, detective.
I'm not a detective.
Of course.
You wanted to see me?
Yes.
Something too important to tell the inspector?
Maybe I just wanted to have a chat.
Well, good luck with that.
I found one of these in my cell. It wasn't recording, but I assume this means he's awake. Basira?
Can we cut the bullshit?
What bullshit might that be?
The part where you pretend you don't spend your whole time watching us.
Sometimes I'm eating.
You know he's back. You've seen him.
Fine. Yes.
So what's with the recorder? Who gave it to you?
Oh, no, that really did just appear in my cell.
Right, so what? You figured you'd record us for him? So some distrust from afar?
Our arrangement with the inspector notwithstanding, I rather feel that right now all the distrust is very much your own. And as to whether he'll ever hear this, maybe he'll get the tapes, maybe he won't, but the recordings have helped so far, so...
Do you know what they are?
What a question.
Fine. So you won't see him, but you're happy for him to hear our conversations?
He can listen all he wants, but he's at a very delicate stage right now, and I fear my presence would be a distraction. I've made it clear my cooperation is contingent on his not seeing me, and my terms have been accepted thus far.
So why am I here? What do you want that's so important you needed to tell me to my face?
I believe you recently lost Melanie.
We saved Melanie.
As a person, yes. But as a defender, I would have thought you would want all the help you could get. Or have you forgotten what happened last time you let your guard down?
We'll work it out.
Possibly. Then again, you are beset by enemies on all sides, Basira. And unless you expect John to record them into submission, it would seem you are in rather dire need of another option.
And you just happen to have one?
I might have an idea, yes.
And what does it cost?
Just some of your time, Basira. Just your time.
Okay, let's hear it.
There. Much better.
You know, I don't care if John hears this.
Come on, Martin. It's been so long since I've seen you. Let's not start with lies.
Fine.
I am so very pleased to see you.
Mm-hmm.
No time for pleasantries? Very well then. To business. What can I do for you? Tired of running budgets for Peter? I know I would be.
I need to... Is he telling the truth?
About what?
Any of it.
Everything Peter has told you is true.
Oh.
For all his many faults, Peter is legitimately trying to stop the end of the world as we know it.
So why haven't you helped him?
My relationship to the apocalypse is more complicated.
Oh, seriously?
Seriously. Anyway, I have helped him. I've given him control of the Institute. I've provided him with...
Me?
Any manpower he might require.
Yeah, but if he's right about the extinction, what it is, then why didn't you say anything before? Why am I only hearing about this now, and why doesn't John know?
In my case, while Peter has talked of it before, it is only very recently that I've been forced to admit the extinction is real. And as for our dear Archivist, I'm afraid I no longer have any real control over what he does or does not know. Unlike yourself. I notice you haven't told him either.
Yeah, well, I'm still not sure I really believe it. And I don't... I'm...
worried he might charge off into another coffin. Quite. As for why I've done so little about such a looming existential threat, to be blunt, I have been rather busy. Besides which, don't forget I am still living at Her Majesty's pleasure, due in no small part to your actions. So by this point, all I can do is confirm that everything Peter has told you is true.
I think he wants me to join the Lonely.
Then it sounds like you have a decision to make.
What? That's it? No monologue, no mind games? You love manipulating people.
That makes two of us. But no, this is too important for me to jeopardize with cheap mind games. I simply have to trust that when the time comes, you'll make the right choice.
Great. So what you're actually saying is that you're going to be no help whatsoever?
Just like old times.
I don't know what I expected. Right, we're done here.
Don't forget to keep in touch, Martin. There are so many people in here, but without one's friends, it does get rather lonely.
Martin Blackwood, assistant to Peter Lucas, head of the Magnus Institute, recording statement number 8671302, statement of Robert Smirk, taken from a letter to Jonah Magnus, dated 13th of February, 1867. My dear Jonah, you will forgive me, I hope, for being so forward, but I feel I must break the silence that has characterized our acquaintance for these past decades. You see, Jonah, I feel the hour of my death approaching, and, though you have always been reluctant to pay due heed to my warnings or counsel, I continue to see in you the reflection of my own past hubris. I could not go easy to my grave without offering you one last plea for your restraint. What we built at Millbank should be left well enough alone, resigned to the nightmares of the reprobates and brigands contained within its walls. I have been blessed with a long life, something few who cross paths with the dread powers can boast. But now, at the end of it, my true fear is that I have wasted it chasing an impossible dream. To speak plain, I have begun to lose faith in the possibility of balance, of any sort of equilibrium among them. It is telling that of those I have brought into my confidence, it is only you and I who have continued this far without falling to one power or another, despite all my instruction and work. This is, of course, assuming you have not taken the path of the eye that I know has called us both for so long, even since before we began our work on Millbank. I suppose I had to believe that the darker natures of our terror could be kept in check, weighed against each other so that the great wheel would keep turning forever, without reaching the velocity I feared would crush us. Perhaps my sin was to see them as something that could be knowable and harnessed. I'm sure you recall what happened with the Reform Club, but you may be unaware of some of my other experiments below the very streets of London. Places I have tried to cover with churches of all things, in the faint hope that perhaps the sight of our Saviour will be enough to contain them. A rather feeble hope for my own salvation. Did I ever tell you about the dreams? I'm sure I must have. I would dream about them, you see, as a young man, long before I devised my taxonomy. I would find myself in nightmares of strange, far-off places, a field of graves, a grasping tunnel, an abattoir knee-deep in pig's blood. I believed then, as I still believe now, that these places I saw were the powers themselves, expressed in their truest form, far more entirely than any secret book can claim. And if, as I came to believe, the dread powers were themselves places of a sort, then surely with the right space, the right architecture, they could be contained, channeled, harnessed. So yes, hubris, not simply in that, I suppose, but in believing that those I brought into my confidence shared my lofty goals. So many have abandoned us, casting about for rituals that I helped design. In my excited discussions with Mr. Rayner, I perhaps extrapolated too much from his talk of a grand ritual of darkness. The dark, I thought, was simply one of the powers, so it stands to reason that each of them should have its own ritual. Perhaps they already did, even before I put pen to paper. They certainly do now, and I shudder to think how Lucas, Scott, and the others may use this conception. 14 powers, with their opposites and their allies, each with an aim no more nor less than manifestation. Apocalypse. Apotheosis. I wonder, did Did my work bring about these dreadful things, or did I simply develop the means by which they can be known? I should have realized, of course, when we first discussed the flesh. For how can there be true balance, each one to its opposite, when new fears can emerge and change as civilization itself grows and alters? When a new power can birth itself, screaming from the torn remnants of others? I know you say the flesh was perhaps always there, shriveled and nascent until its recent growth, but to grant the existence of such lesser powers would throw everything into confusion. Would you have me separate the corruption between insects, dirt, and disease? To divide the fungal bloom from the maggot? No. No, I stand by my work, and thus we must conclude that the only explanation is a new power, created from what was once others, yet also distinct. And if such change is possible, how then can any true balance be achieved through immutable, unchanging stone? I have been dreaming again, Jonah. The same every night for months now. I imagine myself a boy again at Aspley. I awake, cold and alone in the dormitory. The sky outside is dark and I see no stars. I light a candle to better see my way and step down the silent corridor. The master's rooms are empty. The fire in the kitchen is dead. Eventually my steps lead out into the courtyard. It is so quiet that the sound of my feet upon the grass is painful to my ears. I stop and look up at the sky, that empty black nothing, and I see the edges of the horizon becoming a dull white. I cannot understand what I am looking at. And then the sky blinks, and I awake. I am not a fool. I know well enough what this dream is likely to mean, and I warn you again that if you have any remaining ambitions to use our work to try and wear the Watcher's crown, you must abandon them. Not simply for the sake of your own soul, but for that of the world. I have always had the utmost respect for you as a man of dignity and learning. Do not allow yourself to fall to this madness. I have been thinking, of late, about the first origin of the dread powers, if such beings can really be said to have true origins. Are they eternal, or were they created from our own fear by some grand accident, or, worse, some grand design? I believe the latter to be the case, as you well know, for I have in vain struggled to reconcile their creation with the existence of a loving God. They are not demons, of this I am sure, though we have drawn parallels with their acolytes and certain monstrous figures from ancient myth. No, I feel certain they were brought into existence by some ancient civilization, some foolish tribe from prehistory. Do you know of Alexander Cunningham? He's been working with the Viceroy of India on the Indus Valley digs, and has discovered some quite remarkable things. Burial pits full of burned bones and ash, skulls with markings as though the eyes were removed, and others that seem buried alive. Perhaps a dying civilization sought to harness its own terror, as we once thought to harness its results. Of course, such things are pure conjecture. I have not brought Cunningham into my confidence on this, nor do I believe there will be any cause to, even if there was still time remaining to me. Perhaps you wonder why I am so convinced of my imminent demise, and why I should see it as a cause to reach out to you, after so much silence and distrust has passed between us. Certainly, you must either wonder, or you already know all too well. I have been watched for some time now, since shortly before the dreams began. It was subtle at first, easy to ignore and dismiss. What possible harm could there be in the idle glance of a footman, staring at you as you leave your home? And no doubt the shopkeeper is permitted to watch whomsoever he pleases within the confines of his own establishment. So I have been reassuring myself, as I attempted to ignore my own growing disquiet. But what is not to be dismissed is when your driver, on the long road from London, takes his eyes from the horses and begins to turn his head, slowly at first, but with a clear determination, inch by inch without ceasing, neck cracking and skin stretching, until his whole head seems as though it were placed atop his shoulders in reverse by some careless sculptor. The others in my carriage seemed not to mark this awful sight, but I could scarce look away, and the eyes of this twisted figure were locked on my own, tears streaming from their corners. It was such a dreadful spectacle that it took every ounce of my composure not to hurl myself bodily from the coach. The journey was not a short one, and for all those hours the driver did not for a second look away. The horses seemed to take it all in stride. Since then I have attempted to avoid such situations and have travelled primarily by the railway, but even then it seems I cannot avoid the ceaseless gaze of those silent figures who gather along the sides of the track to stare at me as I pass. I count the billowing smoke as a blessing, for although it sends me into coughing fits, it at least serves to hide me from their relentless eyes. I am choosing to assume that these manifestations are unintentional, Jonah, and you have not simply decided to implore a dark patron to end the life of an old man. I further find myself supposing that they may emanate from your own intrigues and preparations to culminate those plans which we agreed to abandon so many decades ago. I beg you, do not pursue this goal. If only a single lesson may be gleaned from my life of long study and longer hardship, it is that the fear of death is natural, and to flee from it will only bring greater misery. Repent of your sins, Jonah. Seek forgiveness. I am certain the dread powers cannot take a soul that keeps faith in the resurrection. As for myself, I must cling to hope, for I cannot ultimately deny the wavering of my own faith. I have pleaded with the Lord to give me strength, to help shield me from the things I have sought these many decades, to protect me as my end draws near. I do not believe my prayers have been heard. Last night I was awoken by a noise from the drawing room. I was in my own bed, and the moon shone through the window, casting the place into a pale and sickly hue, though it was illumination enough to assure myself I was alone. The noise came again, however, and I called out to Laura, asking if she had woken in the night. There was no reply. I struck a match and lit my meagre candle, clinging desperately to its small pinprick of warmth and light, and I crept towards the drawing room. The door opened slowly, and the room within was in pitch darkness, the heavy curtains having been drawn across the window. In the sputtering glow of the candle I could see a figure stood in the corner opposite the door. It wore a long nightdress, and seemed at a glance to be my dear sweet Laura. I let out a breath and began to settle myself, asking her what she was doing out of bed. She did not respond, however. She remained silent instead, facing into the corner of the room. I approached slowly, that restored confidence fleeing me as swiftly as it had arrived, and asked her again. This time she began to turn, with such a slowness I was reminded instantly of the driver. I started to speak again, but at that moment my candle went out, plunging me into abject darkness. I fumbled desperately for a match, and finding one in my nightgown, I struck it in a panic, casting sudden light on my surroundings. Laura's face was inches from my own, her eyes staring into mine, so wide that they seemed to take up half her face or more, bulging grotesquely from their sockets. I screamed, just once. She gave no response of her own. I wanted to run, to lock myself in my room, but under the sight of those horrible eyes my entire body seemed to freeze, and I stood there, match held aloft, eyes locked with this awful parody of my daughter. After an eternity, the flame reached my fingers and I dropped the match, letting the relief of darkness wash over me. I stood there until morning, only to find Laura gone. It was then I began composing this letter. Laura, of course, claims no knowledge of the night's events, having no memory of even leaving her chamber. The eye has marked me for something, of this I have no doubt. My humble hope is that it may be a swift death, an accidental effect of your own researches, which I once again implore you to abandon. It is likely too late for me, but I will not... The letter ends there. Apparently Robert Smirk was found collapsed in his study that evening, dead of, apoplexy. I don't know how the letter reached the archives. I mean, I can guess, but... So what? What does it mean? Am I supposed to be reassured that new entities can be born? That there's some kind of precedent for the extinction? Peter? Huh. Maybe he has gone to a party. Anyway, Smirk was clearly wrong about the powers balancing each other, at least. I mean, it's obviously impossible. There's too much variation in how much something is feared by people at any one time. And if that's the case, I suppose it's not impossible that Peter might be telling the truth. I don't know what he's talking about when he mentions Millbank. The old prison, I guess? Tim said the tunnels under the Institute were all that was left of it, but John said he'd checked them pretty thoroughly. I'm not the one who knows all about this stuff. I wish... No, it's fine. I'm fine. I can do this. I don't know what Peter's planning, but my guess is that it might involve something below the Institute. Hopefully by the time you get these tapes, I'll have something more concrete for you. Good luck, John. Stay safe.
Really, Elias? Really?
Hello, John. Apologies for the deception, but I rather wanted to make sure you started reading, so I thought it best not to announce myself. I'm assuming you're alone. You always did prefer to read your statements in private. I wouldn't try too hard to stop reading. There's every likelihood you'll just hurt yourself. So just listen. Now, shall we turn the page and try again? Statement of Jonah Magnus regarding Jonathan Sims, the Archivist. Statement begins. I hope you forgive me the self-indulgence, but I have worked so very hard for this moment, the culmination of 2 centuries of work. It's rare that you get the chance to monologue through the voice of another, and you can't tell me you're not curious. Why does a man seek to destroy the world? It's a simple enough answer. For immortality and power. Uninspired, perhaps, but my God, the discovery not simply of the dark and horrible reality of the world in which you live, but that you would quite willingly doom that world and confine the billions in it to an eternity of terror and suffering, all to ensure your own happiness, to place yourself beyond pain and death and fear. It is an awful thing to know about yourself, but the freedom, John, the freedom of it all. I have dedicated my life to handing the world to these dread powers, all for my own gain, and I feel nothing but satisfaction in that choice. I am to be a king of a ruined world, and I shall never die. I believe there are far more people in this world who would take that bargain than you would ever guess, and I have beaten all of them. Of course, this desire did not manifest overnight. When Smirk first gathered our little band, Lucas, Scott, and the rest, to discuss and hypothesize on the nature of the things he had learned from Rayner, I felt what I believe we all felt: curiosity and fear. But as he compiled his taxonomy and codified his theories on the grand rituals, I began to develop a very specific concern. Smirk was still so obsessed with his ideas on balance, even as our fellows began to experiment and fall to the service of their patrons. I began to worry that if one of them successfully attempted their ritual, then I would be as much a victim as any, trapped in the nightmare landscape of a twisted world. At first, I attempted prevention, but the cause seemed hopeless. The only way to ensure I did not suffer the tribulations of what I believed to be an inevitable transformation was to bring it about myself. So what began as an experiment soon became a race. Beyond that, I was getting older, and mortality began to weigh more heavily on my mind. How much in this world is done because we fear death, the last and greatest terror? I convinced Smirk to work on Millbank, leading him to design it as a temple to all the fears in equilibrium, such that my own modifications to the design of the Panopticon went unremarked. It took years for the dread of the prisoners that passed through to fully suffuse the place, and I was an old man by the time I made my first attempt at the Watcher's crown, sat in the center of that colossal eye, the great ring of cells encircling me like a coronet. It was flawed, of course, as all Smirk's rituals were, and none of the inmates survived, as the power I attempted to harness shook the building almost to pieces, and the murky swamp upon which the prison was built consumed it. But it left me a gift, for sat in that watchtower I could see everything I turned my mind to. It was a dizzying power, and one I discovered I maintained even as I found vessels to extend my life. Of course, I had to make sure the location was kept under my control while I worked on revising my plans, and so I moved the organization I had founded to assist in my research down to London, and the Institute, as you know it, was born. I'll not bore you with details of my bodies and failures through those intervening years. Suffice to say, I kept busy, both planning my own next attempts and doing my best to stymie those others who tried versions of their own. Surely, my interpretation of the Watcher's crown had been incomplete. There had been some element of the ritual I had overlooked. It was not until I met Gertrude Robinson that things began to really come into focus. You see, the role of Archivist has been part of the Beholding for as far back as my research can go. This isn't uncommon for the powers. Most of the beliefs around them are guesswork and fallible human interpretation, but there are certain through lines and consistencies that can be spotted regardless of the trappings. But Gertrude was unlike any other archivist. She simply did not care about collecting experiences or compiling the fears of others. She was driven to stop those who served the powers. More than once I thought she must secretly be of the hunt, but there was never that sick joy in her, that thrill of predator and prey. She had simply decided that this was her position in life, and went about it with a practicality that even I found disconcerting at times. I once asked her what drove her, what had started her down that path. She told me the desolation had killed her cat. I don't know if she was joking, and, to be honest, I could never bring myself to look into her mind and find out for sure. In any case, Gertrude's ruthless efficiency in derailing and collapsing rituals threw into stark relief a question that had been bothering me for almost 150 years. In the whole span of humanity, why had nobody ever succeeded? Perhaps there were a long line of Gertrude Robinsons throughout history, but I found that hard to credit. Could it be, then, that there was something in the very concept of the rituals that meant they couldn't succeed. She was clearly having similar thoughts in that last year, all of which culminated with the People's Church. When I saw that she was making no preparations whatsoever to stop it, I realized she was putting into practice a theory, and one she couldn't afford to be wrong. She was going to wait and see if the unopposed ritual succeeded, or if it collapsed under its own strain as mine had all those years ago. Knowing Gertrude, I'm sure she had a backup plan if she had miscalculated, but she had not. The ritual failed, and all at once I realized what needed to be done. You see, the thing about the fears is that they can never be truly separated from each other. When does the fear of sudden violence transition into the panic of hunted prey? When does the mask of the stranger become the deception of the spiral? Even those that seem to exist in direct opposition rely on each other for their definition as much as up relies on down. To try and create a world with only the buried makes as much sense as trying to conceive a world with only down. Every ritual tied itself so closely to a single power as to render itself impossible. They could bring their patron close, but could not sever it from the others, and eventually it would be violently pulled back to the place next to reality where they dwell. The solution then is simple. A new ritual must be devised that will bring through all the powers at once. All 14, as I had hoped I could complete it before any new powers such as extinction were able to fully emerge. All under the eye's auspices, of course. We mustn't forget our roots. And there was only one being that could possibly serve as a linchpin for this new ritual. The Archivist, a position that had so recently become vacant thanks to Gertrude's ill-timed retirement plans. Because the thing about the Archivist is that, well, it's a bit of a misnomer. It might perhaps be better named the Archive, because you do not administer and preserve the records of fear, John. You are a record of fear, both in mind as you walk the shuddering dread of each statement, and in body as the powers each leave their mark upon you. You are a living chronicle of terror. Perhaps then, if I could find an Archivist and have each power mark them, have them confront each one, and each in turn instill in them a powerful and acute fear for their life, they could be turned into a conduit for the coming of this nightmare kingdom. Do you see where I'm going, John? It does tickle me that in this world of would-be occult dynasties and ageless monsters, the chosen one is simply that. Someone I chose. It's not in your blood, or your soul, or your destiny. It's just in your own rotten luck. I'll admit my options were somewhat limited, but my God, when you came to me already marked by the web, I knew it had to be you. I even held out some small hope you had been sent by the spider as a sort of implicit blessing on my whole project, and do you know what? I think it was. Of course, I had to bide my time, get a measure of you before I began to push, learn how you worked. So I decided I would wait until something came for you, and see how you reacted. Attacks upon the archives were not uncommon during Gertrude's tenure, and while she was always prepared, I made sure you would not be. I reasoned if you couldn't survive a single encounter, you were unlikely to make it through all 14. So when Jane Prentice attacked, I watched eagerly, one hand on the gas release from the start. You acquitted yourself well enough, so I decided to see how much further you would get, though I waited until the worms were in you to pull the lever. I needed to make sure you felt that fear all the way to your bones. The discovery that one of the Stranger's minions had infiltrated the Institute in the aftermath was certainly a pleasant bonus, even if that sliver of paranoia, that vague wrongness you couldn't quite place, wouldn't count as a mark. It was only a matter of time before it confronted you in a far more direct and affecting manner. Admittedly, given the advent of the unknowing, I needn't have bothered, but what's the old saying about hindsight? More important to me was Sasha's encounter with the distortion. If it had taken an interest, then I very much wanted it to cross your path. So I found one of its current victims and convinced her to make a statement. Poor Helen. I actually had to put her in a taxi myself. She was getting so lost on those narrow London side streets. It worked, though. Between the stabbing and at least 2 desperate flights into its door, you're marked very deep by the spiral. Jürgen Leitner was a surprise, of course, and I was forced to improvise. I had no idea how much Gertrude would have told him, and he could very easily have derailed everything if you learned too much too fast. I justified it to myself, saying I was going to have to send you out into the world anyway if you were going to encounter more of the powers, but I can't honestly pretend it wasn't a rather rash move. Still, I'd requested Detective Tonner be assigned to the case when they found Gertrude's body in the hope that having a hunter in the mix would eventually lead to a confrontation, and setting you up as a killer certainly hastened that. Then it was just a matter of feeding you statements to lead you to a few avatars I thought were likely to harm you, but probably would stop short of actually killing you. Jude served her purpose exactly as I had hoped, as did our dearly departed Mr. Crew, marking you for the desolation and the vast. Honestly, I had nothing to do with Melanie and her slaughter adventure, but when I saw the situation, I made sure to trap her here. So whenever her rage bubbled over, you were right there, a ready target. I didn't foresee the mark coming from surgery gone wrong, but it was a very pleasant surprise. The unknowing was a distraction, but not an unwelcome one. For this to work, you needed more than just the marks. You needed power. And that was something the unknowing served to test, though it posed no actual danger in the grand scheme of things. And it did serve another purpose, of course. It inadvertently pushed you to confront death, a mark I had been very worried about trying to orchestrate. If I tried too early, you'd just die. Too late, and you might be powerful enough to see the attempt coming and maybe even understand why. As it was just right. And once again you came through with flying colors. By this point your abilities were coming on in leaps and bounds, and I was concerned that meeting face to face might end up with you knowing something you shouldn't. I had initially planned to go into hiding, but when your colleagues surprised me with the police, well, it was simple enough to cut a deal. All that remained then were the dark, the flesh, the buried and the lonely. I was a little put out when that idiot Jarrett Hopworth misinterpreted my letters and attacked the Institute too soon, before you were even out of the hospital. But then, you should have seen my face when you voluntarily went to him. I couldn't see what happened in there, of course, but given how you came out, I'm very sure it counts as a mark. I suspected the coffin might turn up again, and once it did, it was simply a matter of getting any, restraining factors you might have had flying off on a wild goose chase, and waiting. Honestly, Detective Tonner has proven invaluable through this whole process. I was racking my brains for months about what I could use to lure you in. And of course I knew the Dark Sun was just sitting there waiting, So when it came time, I whipped up another apocalypse and sent you on your merry way. Then all that remained was the lonely. Poor Peter. He really should have left well enough alone. Or just done what I asked in the first place. Ah, well. He knew what I was attempting and was very unwilling to cooperate until I made him a little wager about Martin. Of course, he had no way of knowing that, in addition to setting you up for the final mark, he was giving you all the tools you needed to escape from it. How is Martin, by the way? He looks well. You will keep an eye on him when all this is over, won't you? He's earned that. And there, I think, we are brought just about up to date. I have enjoyed our little trip down memory lane, but past here lies only impatience. You are prepared. You are ready. You are marked. The power of the ceaseless watcher flows through you, and the time of our victory is here. Don't worry, John. You'll get used to it here, in the world that we have made. Now, repeat after me. You who watch and know and understand none. You who listen and hear and will not comprehend. You who wait and drink in all that is not yours by right. Come to us in your wholeness. Come to us in your perfection. Bring all that is fear, and all that is terror, and all that is the awful dread that crawls and chokes and blinds and falls and twists and leaves and hides and weaves and burns and hunts and rips and bleeds and dies. Come to us. I open the...
The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by rustyquill.com and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike International License. Today's episode was written and performed by Jonathan Sims. It was produced by Alexander J. Newell, Mike LeBeau, and Murray Porter, and directed by Alexander J. Newell. To comment on episodes, make donations and view links, images, videos, and show notes, visit rustyquill.com. Rate and review us on iTunes, visit us on Facebook, tweet us on Twitter @TheRustyQuill, or email us at mail@rustyquill.com. Thanks for listening.